Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to the second session of the Barriers and Benefits to Entrepreneurial Thinking in Government series. My name is Terry Ross. I'm the director of the Hunter Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business. The University of Calgary gratefully acknowledges that this event is not only being held in cyberspace, but also on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and the Stoney Nakoda. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Part of our goal at the Hunter Center is to engage business leaders, practitioners, and students in these sort of strategic conversations. And I'd like to thank the University of Calgary School of Public Policy for partnering on this series to help us do just that. Don't forget that we'll be accepting written Q&A throughout today's event. You can submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and be sure to upvote your favorites. We had an incredible response to last week's conversation with renowned author, academic Mariana Mazzucato, and she certainly left us with a lot to think about and discuss. We've got an equally engaging hour ahead with our expert panel who are going to look at entrepreneurial thinking in government through the lens of Alberta and Calgary. We are so excited for what our panelists bring to the table today. I don't have time to read all their bios, but would encourage you to do so and to follow them. They all have a laundry list of things that they're up to, so I'll just introduce them quickly. Jim DeWald, Dean of the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business. Carol Ann Hilton is the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute in Vancouver. Welcome. Marcia Nelson is a former Deputy Minister of Executive Council in Alberta and is currently an Alberta Blue Cross board member, an executive fellow with both the Haskayne School of Business and the School of Public Policy. Jason Ribeiro is a Director of Strategy with Calgary Economic Development. And finally, I'd like to reintroduce our moderator for this series, Dan Wicklum, the President and CEO of the Transition Accelerator, and an apt person to help steward this panel through a discussion on the barriers and benefits to entrepreneurial thinking in government. Dan, thank you so much. Take it from here.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate it. Welcome to all the panelists and welcome to everyone that's out there in cyberspace tuning in. We'll be monitoring the Q's and A's as we go along here, so please put a question into the stream and we'll answer that or get to those later on in the event here. I'm just going to flag in the speaking notes that Hunter Center put together for me, they talked about that this concept of inspecting government's role in markets and investments was timely. And I would just wow, was it timely? I'm not sure if everyone picked it up. Within the last 2 hours, the government of Canada has announced an investment of over 10 billion with a B in new infrastructure spending. So, the things that we're talking about here today in terms of role of government and innovation in government could not be more pertinent and more timely. So again, this panel follows up on the presentation that was made by Dr. Mazzucato last week. If you haven't seen that, it is on YouTube. So you can actually regroup or take a look at that if you wish. But let me summarize just very quickly the topics and the outcomes of the last event. So essentially what her thesis is that governments could be much more innovative and in that we should be pushing back, re-examining this sort of default that we have, especially in Canada, and maybe especially in Alberta, that governments can't and shouldn't pick winners and losers, so they shouldn't. And the fact that the government as an institution could be and should be much more important in shaping what the future of our society is like, through getting much more involved in markets, being much more directive and being able to define an outcome about what we want our society to look like and how to get there. So the barriers that she talked about were the barriers about why governments can't do this is because there's actually no narrative on the role of government to be able to do that. So they actually don't have public license to be able to do that. She talked about the risk tolerances inside of government, but also risk tolerance of government being driven by the public. She talked about, frankly, the erosion or the lack of government capacity to be able to take on this role. Even if they wanted the role, maybe they couldn't. She talked about the lack of there being a clear, targeted, measurable, mission-oriented direction. And as we talked about this last week, and questions and answers that went to her, this really was sort of crystallized into what is the role of government? Why is government here? Are we giving latitude to government to play a sufficiently broad role for society, or have we boxed them in a way where essentially a society is rudderless and just end up I'd say lurching into the future and attaining a future state that is out of our control? For me, that's really what this comes down to, is what is the role of government? So maybe we'll just jump right into it here. And I'm gonna turn to Jim and ask him the first question. And within that framing, which is remarkably complex, Jim, I'm gonna ask you a simple question that's almost impossible to answer. And that is, do we need new thinking? And what would be some elements of that new thinking?
Well, thanks so much, Dan. And this is such a great topic. And as you say, really perfect timing. So I want to give some context, though. It's very important, I think, for everybody on the panel, for the audience to recognize that I approach a topic like this, frankly, any topic, from my position as a business strategy professor. And I look at, and I'm going to use the example, Alberta as an organization or as a firm. And my own research has found that it's very critical, and I'm going to talk about the risk tolerance barrier in particular, Dan. My research shows that it's very critical for firms to reinvent themselves and to have a healthy mix of what we call exploitation and exploration. So the idea that sticking to what you've done in the past is somehow a low-risk strategy is actually a fallacy. We call that exploiting. But we also know that organizations need to be exploring. They need to be looking for what's the next thing. There's always a tendency for an organization that has been successful to pine for the good old days, if you will. And let me emphasize, that is actually a risk-taking strategy, not risk-averse. Sometimes referred to as driving by looking in the rearview mirror. And that image makes it pretty clear that it's risky, because we don't want anybody on the road driving, looking in the rearview mirror. Now, in addition, some will say, because there is a pandemic going on, it is time to retreat to the familiar. But again, I have to disagree for two primary reasons. Number one, the pandemic does not slow down progress. It actually accelerates change. There's a very simple reason for this, because in normal times, change is held back primarily by a hesitation for people to adopt. But when there's a traumatic shock, like a pandemic, that actually drives technological change. And we see it right today, what we're doing right now, an event like this with a number of people on it, that wouldn't have happened just a year ago. The other thing that's really important when there's something like a disruption of a pandemic is to recognize that people bounce. And let me explain that. Nicholas Nazim Taleb, and actually I've got his book here, the Black Swan Theory guy, he wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. And essentially what he says, Dan, is that mechanical things, when they break, they're fragile, they break, they're broken. But organic, like muscles, like people, like organization, are anti-fragile, and they bounce, and they can even bounce to better places than where they were. And a saying that captures that is the old saying, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. So in summary, I want to turn this idea of lack of risk tolerance totally on its head, and instead suggest it's highly risk-taking to wish for a return to old ways and to not invest heavily in the future, particularly at times like that, like today. And that's what I'm seeing, not necessarily seen enough of, I'm going to say on a provincial level, but I think we really need. Thanks.
Yeah, great. So typical do-all, very strong opinion, clear, succinct. So Jace, I'll turn to you. And it seems to me that that same question is a good one for the panel to sort of focus in on, and maybe we can see a breadth of opinion. So same thing back to you. Does Alberta need new thinking? And if it was, what would it look like?
Well, thank you for the question, or technically two questions. And the answer—
That's a little moderator trick, by the way. So
yeah, no worries. The answer to the first is yes. Does Alberta need new thinking? Yes. But I want to step back for a moment and be a little bit defensive as an Albertan. As someone who's chosen to leave Eastern Canada to live in this province and is now raising my son here with my wife and possessing the perspective, frankly, of having lived and worked in places across the country and the globe, I can confidently tell you that if you pose that same question about another city, state, or country to leaders from that jurisdiction, you'd likely get the same answer I just gave. And really, that's why we're here today. Professor Mazzucato's globally recognized work is not just interesting for its application to Alberta, because we happen to be so positively or negatively unique in the grand scheme of things. We're here because the implications of her work should be spurring very thoughtful discussions, not just here, but across the globe, about how we collectively frame a better system for pursuing sustainable, inclusive, and innovation-led economic growth. Because I believe if we did float the question, are the dominant economic and policy frameworks we've established as a society as good as they can be, I believe the overwhelming answer would be no, here and beyond. So I wanted to quickly introduce that caveat because so many decision makers are wrestling with these very same issues. So given that I've established that Alberta needs new thinking, let me quickly introduce potentially two domains in which I believe that thinking needs to occur, and to answer your question, what that might look like. So the first I would contend is in response to digital transformation and the fourth industrial revolution. If we can all agree that the game has changed, why would we keep playing with the rules and the equipment of decades ago? Truly, why would we accept in economic or fiscal policy what we wouldn't accept in literally any other realm of life when the stakes are this high? No one would skate for a puck against Johnny Gaudreau with Maurice Richard's skates. So why would we meet a new digital era without new frameworks for co-investment, particularly downstream, and long-term public financing for research and development that embraces risks and rewards, both risks and rewards across the innovation chain? And then the second is the fundamental need to take a cross-sectoral approach in addressing these really, really wicked problems facing our province. And I make these remarks not only wearing the hat of the Director of Strategy at Calgary Economic Development, but as a doctoral candidate researching cross-sector partnerships, but also interestingly enough, as a former political commentator. A smart government and a strong economy go hand in hand. And what has been well documented over the last 40 years is the rising anti-government sentiment that has emerged globally, but particularly in North America. It is, proven to be remarkably successful in politics, but in every way has hamstrung the ability for any government's resulting policy to be overly ambitious, investment and mission oriented, and also left us with unequal growth and an alarming debt burden. So I want to make clear that smart government doesn't necessarily need to mean big government. And an investment-driven public sector does not necessarily mean a big spending public sector that crowds out the private sector. It's about defining these higher level missions in Alberta that matter to us as Albertans and forming the focused partnerships needed to execute them. So Mazzucato's framework for mission-oriented policy should be equally appealing to the political left and right and everyone in between in Alberta for its broad focus on adequately funding a strong and creative public service and for being investment-driven in a way that delivers healthy dividends and co-creates robust markets for taxpayers.
All right, great. I'm actually going to reference one of the Q's and A's from Gerald. And Jim, it looks like you've got a fan there. Gerald starts off with saying, Jim is bang on. That's always good. What Gerald goes on to talk about in that Q&A is about culture. It's the culture of government. So I wonder if we could sort of play with that a little bit. Caroline, I'll look to you. This notion of, the overarching question is, do we need a new way of thinking? But to follow on that is this notion of public narrative. And it seems to me that government culture and their ability to take risks to some extent is dictated by the latitude that the public, we as voters, give government in order to innovate and take risks and so on. And that requires a narrative. So do we need a new way of thinking? And what's the public narrative now in the role of government in the public policy realm?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And this is a fantastic conversation. I come from the perspective of building an indigenous economic focus here in this conversation. Some of you may have heard of the concept of indigenomics. I describe it as modern indigenous economic design. So I wrote a book called Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, which essentially centers Canada's narrative within the truth that this country and the regions were formed on systemic Indigenous economic exclusion, and that the future and well-being of Canada must be shaped on Indigenous systemic economic inclusion. I also position that Canada itself was shaped within the lens of the Indian problem, and policy follows within that lens. So I position the question in this discussion: what do we really know about Alberta's Indigenous economy? And in asking that question, the underlying intention: how many First Nations economic development corporations are there in Alberta? How many Indigenous businesses are there? What is the size of Indigenous economic impact in the region? How does this compare to previous years or over 10 years? What is the size of the Indigenous labor force here? What are the unemployment rates? How many Indigenous female businesses are there? These all serve as central questions which point to the absence of solid Indigenous economic data sets to understand the evolving growth of the Indigenous economy, specifically in Alberta, as well as equally so within the larger national economy. I want to note the ever-increasing need to understand the regional Indigenous economy, but also to center facilitation of positive leadership in economic reconciliation that supports growth and inclusion. Now, in asking those questions of what we actually understand about Alberta's Indigenous economy, I placed two significant reports. One was the Atlantic region of the Collective Four Provinces, which identified annual contributions of over $2.9 billion annually to those regional economies. Lastly, the Manitoba province established that the Indigenous contribution to the regional economy was just over $9 billion annually. So in asking this question of new ways of thinking within this public narrative, I positioned the concept that what is essential to support Indigenous economic design as a mechanism for growth is that what is required is the tools and the institutions and the infrastructure to support the Indigenous economy evolution. So when we look at specific tools such as the Alberta Business Investment Fund, the Indigenous Opportunities Fund, what we are seeing is the early construct of the shift from simply programs and services to the infrastructure and the required investment for Indigenous economic design. What I am intending to do within portraying the realization of the ever-growing Indigenous economy is to locate Alberta's leadership in the national narrative of the evolving $100 billion Indigenous economy that I'm leading here at the Indigenomics Institute. To look at mission-driven policy and utilizing the concept of Indigenomics as modern Indigenous economic design, that is the forward thinking that we need both for reconciliation and to understand the ever-growing impact of the Indigenous economy within the Alberta region. Thank you.
Caroline, great comments. You brought sort of a clarity of arguments there that I have an easy time understanding. Appreciate that. What I'm going to try to do here is thread in a couple of the Q's and A's to involve the audience. I'm going to say, first of all, Jason, you've also got a supporter in Colin McLeod. He loved your comments. I see Peter Bulkowski, who was actually quite active at the last event we had, asking questions. This question here he talks about and asks about is this notion of not just looking forward, but having the ability, and is it not required, to look back in history in a framework of understanding what's worked and what has failed in governments. So I'm taking that as somehow to embed any type of innovation that we have in the government in a continuous learning framework. And then Pete Fenwick gave a link that is something, a report done by the Canadian Council of Academies. And just a very quick aside, if people don't know the Canadian Council of Academies, it's an institution that was set up by the federal government. So it's independent, arm's length from government, that has federal funding. And by definition, that institution takes questions from governments, both federal and provincial, and does independent analysis that governments have. So in a very real way, that whole concept, that organization, Canadian Council of Academies, was a recognition that governments sometimes don't have the ability to ask and answer, even departmentally, don't have the ability to ask and answer independently questions. So by definition, it's almost an outsourcing of a government function that the government has institutionalized in this organization, Canadian Council of Academies. So, and so let me riff on that then, and look to you, Marcia. Marcia's an ex-deputy, uniquely placed to talk about government capacities and so on. So same questions for you, Marcia. Do we need to think differently? But especially, what are your thoughts on Alberta government capacity and where that should be going?
Thanks, Dan. Well, like everyone else, I'm going to say we do need to think differently. And maybe where I differ a bit is that having been in government, I see governments searching for that new thinking all the time. So to characterize government as kind of a monolithic behemoth of a single set of thoughts is too simplistic. I think we all need to understand that government and the construction of government is a very complex beast. There are 24 departments, there's 300 agencies, boards, and commissions. There are different levels of government. There are political leaders and administrative leaders. So there's a lot of independent thinking. There's a lot of independent interests. And I think that's a construct we have to keep in mind when we're talking about government. With respect to the Alberta government, I would focus on three areas that I think capacity issues need to be focused on and addressed. The first is increasing government's own policy capacity. The second is increasing its capacity to consult and engage with the broader public. And the third is really around ministerial responsibility and ministerial accountability. So with respect to policy capacity, in the 90s, when the federal government went about cutting its transfers to the provinces, all across the country, you saw the reduction of staff, you saw the reduction of certain functions within government, and there came to be, a view, particularly in Alberta, that the role of the public service was to implement policy, and the role of the political leaders is to develop policy and make decisions about policy. And that had the result of really decreasing Alberta's policy capacity, that ability to have lots of smart people in government that have the intellectual capital, the intellectual capacity to be curious and ask questions and do the research and connect with experts outside of government. So as you rightly said, Dan, there was a great outsourcing across many governments in Canada of their policy capacity. And I think what we saw in sort of the mid-2005-6 era was recognition across the country that has been a mistake. Again, going to our audience member talking about looking back before we move ahead, we had to learn from that. And so you saw efforts all across the country really focused on rebuilding government's policy capacity. And that's not just people, that's culture, that's leadership, that's relationships. So I think today, one of the things that the Alberta government really has to think about as it is reshaping itself in our new economic reality is that we really need to make sure that we preserve in government the capacity to ask the right questions, to basically connect with what's going on there in the world and be creative about solutions we're proposing to governments. Secondly, the consultation capacity. It's absolutely incredible that we have this range of tools available to us now to connect with citizens in a real-time method. And so I think no government has any excuse not to be actually reaching out and trying to gather the advice and the opinions of citizens, because as citizens, we're adults now, right? We want to be consulted about our economic future. We want to have a sense of determination around that and not just leave it to governments, in a black room, in a dark room to think this up themselves. So I think the notion that governments need to have better consultation and engagement capacity built in right from the beginning is absolutely essential. And then the last point I'd make is I guess around ministerial accountability. What we've seen in modern governments is a tremendous tendency to centralize all decision-making authority and really all accountability into a very small group of people at what you would call the center, right? And that means, usually means the Premier's office, the Prime Minister's office, Treasury Board. In the end, you can say at some points in government, there's about 5 people running government. And as you know, as I've just said, it's a very complex business. So what happens when you've got very few people trying to manage many, many issues is you get a funnel, right? You get a very tight kind of capacity or lack of capacity to really deal with all the issues at hand. People call it limited bandwidth, right? That governments have limited bandwidth. They can only deal with a few issues at a time. And that's because governments have become too overly centralized. And I think one of the things we need to do in order to support innovation, to support new thinking, is to make sure that ministers who are responsible for departments and responsible for advancing all of our interests are actually empowered to get out there and connect with their communities, seek the best advice, and move that forward. So that would be my sense of kind of the 3 things I think governments really need to do in short order.
All right. Going into the questions here, and folks, keep those questions coming in. We're looking at them for sure. Here's your answer, or your opportunity to ask the tough things. And my request is, let's make these panelists earn their keep, ask them the really tough questions. So plus just sort of fun. So let me weave a couple of questions together here. There's a couple of people. I'm looking at Dexter Lamb, and I'm looking at there's someone from Iraq. Boy, I lost track. Carl Miller. Again, it's hypothesizing that it's as much about this concept of government culture that in turn is really dictated by the public, because the public votes in governments. So it's this notion of government culture being driven or dictated or a function of or resulting from the risk tolerance of citizens. Now, let me unpack that into one question. Might be an easy one, I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand, so what are the determinants of culture? And there's probably whole doctoral theses that are being written on this, but what about organizational size? So we think of governments as these big bureaucracies, and they are. The Government of Canada is by far the largest organization in this country. So to what extent is the structure of an organization, its size, and how it's governed related to its ability to be innovative? And so what I'm trying to do is take it out of the realm of government, the conversation. It's really around, regardless of whether it's private sector or private sector, do we have a problem with the size of government and how it's organized, that these bureaucracies sort of collapse under their own weight because of the systems required to make decisions, and you end up being not that innovative simply because of size, quite apart from these other things. Any thoughts on the panel?
Let me jump in on that one, because my view is that I think focusing on size and structures is a bit of a red herring. When you think about how culture is developed, yes, the structures and processes of an organization have a big impact, but really leadership and culture are, I think, the much stronger determinants of of an organization's organizational culture and really their approach to innovation. So I think large organizations can be very innovative, but it's not the whole organization that's innovative. It can be pockets within that. So I think, I think I would look more to leadership and versus size.
Yeah, Dan, I'd really like to jump in on that also. And first, I want to clarify that, I so appreciate Marcia's comments, and I like her three-legged stool, which I would define as more like, the most powerful V12 engine ever built. If you've got that policy capacity and you have that consultation capacity, ministerial responsibility, you're ready to rock and roll. But you need the driver, you need the leader who's going to move you down the path. And so when questions about changing that, it's not a simple answer, but you need those two elements very much in sync. And I am very inspired when I look back at, Peter Lougheed's time in Alberta. I'm very inspired when I look at JFK and the moonshot. I'm very inspired when I heard last year at the Distinguished Policy Awards for the School of Public Policy, and Jim Gray got up. Jim Gray, whose history is all oil and gas, got up and said, I want us to set a vision by 2030 that our upstream and midstream industries are net zero. Like, that's what I'm talking about. Like, that's the kind of inspiration that'll really move us into a new direction and get this province where we want it to be.
Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in right there. And I think the points made by Marcia and Jim are well taken. But I think, I do want to go one step further to say, while we in many ways romanticize the transformational impacts of these single individuals that made that one speech or that one declaration that set in motion a number of things that either in many cases were already underway. They just provided the voice and the charisma potentially to be able to action it. That in and of itself is not a sustainable model. We can't wait, every 4 years or however many years for someone to make the right speech at the right time that met the moment in the right way. I think it's part of it. It's an accelerant, but I think we still need and to Dr. Mazzucato's point, we still need to be, mission oriented as a society, as Albertans, and that is not just one in the hearts of minds of one speech. That is something that we need to really focus on outcomes. And I think if we can address that, the outcomes are not what we want, it will sort of spur the new thinking about what could be. And so, if we think about the criteria set out by Dr. Mazzucato about these missions, they must engage the public during their selection. They must be ambitious but realistic. I don't think that we need to look too far for examples that we can draw from. At CED, our mandate is literally cross-sectoral in nature, in that we work with business, government, and community. And not to chest thump too much, we are executing a mission that pretty well meets Mazzucato's criteria. And that is our community's economic strategy, Calgary and the New Economy. We consulted, we're thinking about these big audacious challenges, but what about right here in our local community? We consulted over 1,800 Calgarians. We powered an audacious vision for Calgary to be the city of choice for the world's best entrepreneurs who are embracing tech to solve the world's greatest challenges, including cleaner energy, safe and secure food, the efficient movement of goods and people, and better health solutions. It's measurable, it's time-bound, and it was passed unanimously by City Council in 2018. So we have all of the pieces in place that would map to what Dr. Mazzucato would define as a mission. We have to think more creatively about financing tools. Well, we're leveraging a pretty interesting financing tool called the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund, which is $100 million of public dollars aimed at catalyzing economic growth, retention and diversification, employment growth, and an increase to the property tax assessment base, which is particularly vexing in Calgary. So this is not about picking winners and losers, and this is also not about, I think, seeking out these very romantic suggestions of what could be. There has been some experimentation that we could really scale. and about fulfilling the missions that we've agreed to as Calgarians that fill in key gaps in our ecosystem and as Albertans, I should mention. But leverages shared investment across orders of government and the private sector and makes good on a promise that we're doing this together. That's what I think is really going to move the dial here. So I think our province is in need of new thinking, that we need mission-oriented visions or more mission-oriented visions, but that doesn't mean that we can't pursue them now or that we don't have good examples of experimentation that we can scale and reward. And the foundation for all of that should be the enough commonality that exists amongst us as Albertans and particularly here as Calgarians to meet the moment with more entrepreneurial innovation and thinking. I don't think it's just government. I think all of us really need to rally around that.
Interesting. Carol Ann, any comments on that, or we can move on to the next question?
For sure. Thank you. So I come from a number of fronts. As the only Indigenous person that was appointed to the Federal Economic Growth Council, we look to today's announcement from the Infrastructure Bank, which identified $10 billion focus. That was a direct outcome of a jolt to the system, of a belief that establishing the conditions and requirements for Canada to be best able to respond to a rapidly globalizing environment. Those are examples that happen at a national level, but also expressed at the regional level. So we also look to examples such as the digital superclusters, where we're seeing regional engagement, but designed from a government perspective. I also am coming directly from, for the BC focus, but the Emerging Economy Task Force, which was a 25-year outlook, but also driving citizen engagement in policy design and that jolt to those systems. So understanding in the Mazzarato talk about the establishment of conditions of smart, sustainable, and innovative, I think that is the primary directives of which being able to reflect on new actions can support new thinking in a broader sense of how many people do we engage in this conversation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm going to change direction just a little bit here. It strikes me from the Q's and A's and the conversation from the last event and this one here that one of the key issues again is this notion of the public and the electorate giving governments the latitude to be innovation and not punishing governments that try to innovate and have some proportion of the innovation inevitably fail. That's what happens when you innovate. Not everything is successful. Do we have a good understanding of how governments have either succeeded in this or failed in this concept of innovating and directing in the past? Because it strikes me our public narrative is that governments have never been good at it, ever, no place, and therefore we shouldn't be doing this. I'm being a bit inflammatory here to prompt some conversation, but I think most people I would think would tend to think that that's not the business government should be in, sort of set the policy, set the regs, provide funding, get out of the way, let the private sector take care of it. My null hypothesis is that's actually not being fair to government. But panel, what do you think?
Well, maybe I'll jump in, Dan. I know that's a popular narrative, but Dr. Mazzucato made it very clear that the evidence doesn't support that. In fact, there's lots of areas where government investment has been critical, if not, the crucial cornerstone of innovation and growth. And I think we have to remember that. And we do want to support that. I just want to say I really agree with everything Jason said. I think we're all aligned with this. There's not a risk in terms of necessarily long-term success, but there's a risk in terms of politics, because some things that you try to drive are not going to be successful. Some are going to be successful. And I think we have to be careful to make sure that we're going in lots of different streams. And so anyhow, in answer to your question, no, I really don't buy that narrative that governments are just inept at supporting innovation.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that as well, Dan.
Please.
In my experience, only the failures get news attention, none of the successes. And I could list a set of successes a mile long, and many of the benefits that we see in this province would not have occurred had not government taken a very active role. The challenge goes back to some of this, the risk aversion that you're talking about, and risk aversion relates to politics. I recall when I was Deputy Minister of Innovation and Advanced Education, we were trying to basically take Dr. Musicato's advice and provide clarity to the plethora of innovation agencies that exist out there with government's critical priorities, right? Because there's all kinds of agencies that have been developed and mandated to do this work. In part, government develops these arm's length agencies in order to kind of transfer risk, so that when decisions are made, it's not being made by a minister through a political lens, it's being made by a third party or an arm's length agency informed by science and consultation and all these other good things, right? So these agencies were desperately seeking direction from government about what's important to you, because there's only so much money that's allocated in the system. So we spent time with health, agriculture, forestry, economic development, energy, environment, all the sectors of the economy, and all those departments and all those ministers, to try and develop what are government's, mission statements, right? What are our moonshots that we need to address? Classically, you'd think of climate change and emissions reduction. You'd think of, health innovation and a variety of things, right? So we developed it. We put it all together. We had the accountable ministers in a room, and we were trying to get them to make a decision, right? To basically get behind something, anything. And those ministers really struggled to do that, in part because they were concerned about the politics, of making some choices, and not in terms of companies, but in terms of goals. And, they were also not empowered, by the political system and the premier of the day at the time in order to do this work. So, I think the thinking is out there, but we need to make sure that the equation around risk tolerance is one that is, I think, more informed by where we need to go as a province, as opposed to, concern about today's headlines.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go to a question from the audience here. Karen Benzies. This is interesting because I think coming on the heels of that remarkable presidential debate that most of us probably tuned into, and I take that as sort of as a commentary as the state of politics at its worst. Not trying to say that's what it's like in Canada or in Alberta, but that's politics at its worst. And that is, of course, the environment within which governments have to innovate. So what Karen is talking about here is this notion of what's the balance between public consultation and action. So, through Professor Mazzucato's presentation last week and several times on the panel here today, people talk about, the ability for governments to innovate requires them to engage, if you will, get public license from the public, get good ideas and so on. But we seem to be in this place now where interest groups will definitely use public consultation as a purposely to put a stick in the spokes of progress. They will use that to advance their means. That's always going to happen. And so we're in this sort of vicious cycle of needing to consult, but having a difficult time stopping consultation, drawing conclusions, and acting. So any comments from the panel in terms of those dynamics, or the balance between the need to publicly consult and yet at some point act to achieve a mission?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I'm sure Carol Ann has a number of thoughts on this as well too. Look, I think the problem with the consultation as it exists currently is that it's not very good. So we can't hold that up as saying, hey, if we just did more of this thing that we're doing poorly, things would be better and the public would be more informed. And that goes for all public consultations done across the board. And there was an interesting book released, I think it was a couple of years ago, by Dave Meslin called Teardown, which shows not just how underfunded the public services is engaging thoughtfully, but just the lack of innovation and creativity about how you go about doing that. Think about the experience that you have when you go to get something registered, or you go to pick up an approval for a new home build or something like that, and you walk into maybe a blank walled, very dark, very sullen building, that's enough to sort of turn people off from ever wanting to go and engage with that entity again. And then think about the private sector, and think about all the innovations, not even just within COVID-19, but previously about, I look at just across the street here, our beautiful Calgary Public Library. And the fact that, simple things like backlighting the shelves where books are contained is something that only an Indigo or a Chapters would do. But the Calgary Public Library made an effort to do something so small because they said more people check out more books if they're more attractive to look at. Government has to think like that in terms of its engagement with people and being more creative. And I'll just follow up on a tail end of the last question, which was, why is there such a difference within government and not the private sector, et cetera? I think what this has come down to, our conversation around leadership and culture. Why would we hold particular values in one set about what private sector leadership looks like and not about what public sector leadership looks like? If you're managing people and you're managing resources, there's many of these things that are common that we can be looked across. So there is also bad business that is being done, and then there's good business, and there's bad governmental investments, and then there's great governmental investments. What we need to really think about is the communications of the difference between the good and the bad, and by the confidence and the trustworthiness through sound results of the public to be able to do more instead of less.
I've got a comment here, and then I'll go back to the panel to see if anyone has sort of comment on this. But I came across some super nifty software about 6 months ago that's actually out of Scandinavia, where a company or an organization can engage in real time via their home computers or work computers up to 5,000 people in a structured discussion. And it's all sort of, as you might expect, based on an organization wanting to ask their employees or citizenry very specific questions. And as people chat, there's a bots and some live moderation where people of like mind get together in the next phase, and they keep refining and discussing, and they come up with the end result after, even as little as a couple hours is, bucketed answers to the questions and some semblance or some understanding of what proportion of your organization agrees with answer A, B, C, or D to the question, because they've all been involved in developing these answers in very real time. So it does strike me that this notion of engagement is so important that maybe we have not kept up with the potential that our new technology and tools has to engage in different ways that might address some of these things. But back to the panel, any riffing on Jason's comments?
Well, I think that the whole topic of consultation is very complex, Dan, because it's not only do you ask, what do you ask, when do you ask, so on and so forth. And at the same time, there is a need for action and for leadership. If you stand back and just go up a level and you say, we have to make generational change in what we're doing with our organization, probably the worst idea you could ever have is to say, and by the way, we can change our entire leadership team every 4 years. So in that sense, it's completely crazy how we're structured. So it's tough. All I'm saying is that it's a real balancing act when you get people in, they need to be trying to think long-term, but they're faced with the short-term death, possibly. So it's very, very tricky. It's easy to criticize. And I don't know if Marcia has any comments on this, but it's very easy to criticize, but hard to do it the right way.
This is called a pregnant pause.
I guess I'm just thinking, absolutely, Jim, I agree with everything you've said. But even in 4-year limited time cycles, I've seen governments be incredibly innovative, and I've seen them suffer alternatively from what I would call consultation constipation, right? Like they just spend all their time consulting and they never finish consulting, and it never seems to, go anywhere. And then, their term is up. But certainly, I've seen great examples of how government has used kind of old methods, but also new tools in order to consult and develop really important policy. I think about the social policy framework that was developed with Dave Hancock's leadership, and I think there were like 40,000 people that were involved in the development of that, and that was in the early days of using wikis and other kinds of online consultation. The climate policy that was developed by the recent NDP government used an expert panel. It had public consultations, it had online consultations, it had a whole set of tools that were brought to bear to bring action in a really short period of time. And it broadly had the buy-in of the majority of stakeholders at the time. So I think I think there are ways to do this, but you have to be invested in both the process and the outcome. And too often, and I'm sure Carol Ann would have some views of this, that consultations seem to be done to just check the box, as opposed to have a meaningful and important dialogue that will ultimately change your outcomes. So that requires a real buy-in to it.
Carol Ann, any thoughts? We've got lots of questions streaming in here, so there's no shortage of things to talk about, but any thoughts on that one?
For sure. So coming from that Indigenous perspective, at the Institute, in driving a national $100 billion Indigenous economic agenda that says at its foundation, Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses. I referenced previously of this inherited concept of viewing Indigenous peoples as a problem. So at the $32 billion value of the Indigenous economy currently versus $100 billion Indigenous economy, from that regional perspective, I ask that question: to future pace an Indigenous economic reality, how do we make decisions differently at the policy level, future pacing a economic target? So realizing that combination of investment, tools, institution, and infrastructure, that's really, again, what I would bring into this larger discussion of the construct and facilitation of asking these questions of where it is that you're going. Thank you. Great.
I'm going to poach from the questions and synthesize one. Jim, your opening statement, one of the things that I picked up on was essentially this idea that doing nothing is a decision. So what does that mean for us, I think, in Alberta, relative to our context in our country and internationally, if other governments are exploring and innovating in ways that we aren't? If we don't do anything, if we just sort of let the tape play out, and that's a conscious decision, as you very much pointed out, where's this likely to end up for Alberta? Anyone? It was your idea, Jim, but don't need to pick on you. Anyone?
Well, for starters, absolutely, it is a decision to do nothing. I think the other thing that we're missing a bit in Alberta is we're incredibly fortunate to have a platform to work off of. We keep thinking we're not getting enough for our platform, but we should be saying, no, we've got this strong foundation. Now what can we do in new areas like Jason's talked about? And we're making a decision by not investing enough in those new areas, and just in my opinion.
And I just want to piggyback on that, because I think Jim is exactly right. And in terms of, kind of letting the tape play out, there are some signs of hope as of late. The recent announcements in Amy and the platform not just being, a world-class energy sector, which also spans, one of the top-ranked global ecosystems in clean tech, also within Alberta and in Calgary, $100 million clean resource innovation network for seeking solutions for carbon emissions. So we have a lot of the tools here on that platform, but I will even say that, to Jim's point, we also have a platform on artificial intelligence. That is starting to see investment as well from the provincial government and is making noise the world abound. And so we just need to keep building these platforms and then thinking more creatively about the financing tools that allow us to crowd in investment. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen as of late is lacking foreign direct investment. And while that is, always about a little bit of a story that you paint about the investment climate or the investment market, it really is about, well, what are the opportunities for me to invest? And we need to think more creatively about calling people in and not calling people out, about how we can attract, folks here to what is, foundationally a very, very good business environment. That's where we can be more creative. That's where I think Mazzucato's work, not in whole, but in parts, is very, very intriguing about these new financing methods for the missions that matter to us as Albertans.
I want to jump in on that one as well, Jason, because you made the point that there's some encouraging signs of late, and certainly with the current Alberta government on investing in areas that are going to be critical, to our economic future. And again, that goes back to consultation. The current government had a view of how the world was going to work when it was elected, and it made some decisions to cut certain incentive programs that many other jurisdictions had used very effectively. And I think it left Alberta quite disadvantaged in relation to, for example, the tech sector. And so the government took some time. They listened to a variety of the partners that exist in that space. And then they took, I think, some important steps on establishing programs to make sure those incentives were there. And so I think it goes back to that willingness to really to engage with folks that are affected and to and allow it to change your outcomes. And one last little comment I'll make is that the reason why Alberta has an international leadership position in artificial intelligence is because the Alberta government funded that for many, many years. I was, again, deputy of innovation and advanced education, and we were scraping together $2 million to provide to the University of Alberta for this exciting work like 10 years ago, before anybody thought it was a great idea. Now, all of a sudden, it's fantastic, but that's a clear example of government being willing to invest in something new, something risky, and it was all kind of under the radar until we've had a success story.
Good to hear about that. And that story I know well, and I'm frankly proud of as an Albertan. Okay, we're getting right down to the wire here. The top voted question from Carl Miller, who proudly wears his NRC IRAP title in his online presence, basically says this: given everything we talked about, what could governments do actually to take a step in the right direction? So given our time, we've got about probably 30 to 45 seconds per panelist. Maybe your top one or two things, folks. What could governments actually do to take steps in the right direction here? Who's first?
I'll be brave, and I'll also be vain and draw from what I said before, which is governments can take a more open innovation approach. The fact that we're having this conversation is because we have very clearly defined lines between what is government, what is the private sector, what is community, and otherwise. Those lines are becoming blurred by our challenges. We need to take a cross-sectoral approach that's forward-looking.
Open innovation and cross-sectoral. Anyone else?
I'll say, Dan, that no one ever cut themselves to greatness. This government has to realize there's two sides to the ledger. Bring in the money, invest it wisely, we'll do well.
Being frugal is not always the answer in all situations. Anyone else?
Sure. Caroline, I believe very strongly that it would be in Alberta's interest to establish an Indigenous economic baseline metric to understand the growing strength of the Indigenous economy. Without that, is essentially floating in the water. You don't have the data to support the strength of your Indigenous economic relationship. Build the metrics, build the baseline, and compare that over time.
If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And an Indigenous community is so important for this province. That's got to be front and center for us. And Marcia, last word.
Well, for me, I think it's absolutely critical the government set its priorities, be clear about what it is we're trying to achieve, and then you can develop partnerships, you can consult widely, you can gather the best solutions from all over the world, and implement them here for our economic prosperity.
If you're not crisp in defining where you want to go, you can't get there. So with that, I'm going to thank all the panelists. I'm going to turn it over to Terry Ross. I really enjoyed that, folks. I really appreciate you being on the panel. Terry.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you for doing such an outstanding job moderating both panel sessions. Really appreciate that. I want to thank all of our panelists, Carol Ann, Marcia, Jim, Jason. Thank you so much for participating. You know, I think Albertans and Canadians and Indigenous peoples have many of the elements needed to upgrade our opportunities together. Although the challenges of leadership, community engagement, and confidence are real, but we're choosing to develop a more optimistic and innovative approach to government. And I'm very excited about what the future will hold. We'll hope that you'll all look for ways to continue this conversation after this series, and please be sure to respond to us with feedback. We're going to send out some questionnaires along with links to these events so that we can help organize better events in the future. Thank you to everybody at the Hunter Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation and the School for Public Policy. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you and goodbye.